Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to talk about the 2017 UK general election. Now this is a really interesting election because it's an election that totally defies expectation. Theresa May calls the election because she's hoping to win a majority, and she expects to win a majority because she's 20 points ahead in the polls. And really what she's trying to do is secure a majority in order to get Brexit done, in order to get her deal through Parliament in the face of disagreement and division within the Conservative Party, with figures on the right of the party wanting a really hard Brexit, wanting a clean break from the European Union, where we're not, for example, members of the single market and the customs union, and figures on the left of the party wanting a soft Brexit or perhaps even wanting a second referendum. So she's got this divided party, and her calculation is that if she calls an election when she's 20 points ahead in the polls, she's going to be able to secure a big majority, and that's going to allow her to deliver the kind of Brexit that she wants to deliver. Unfortunately for her, the election does not go to plan, and it defies all of the expectations of the pundits, the commentators. Really, anybody that discusses this election in the run-up to it is expecting Theresa May to secure a majority, and she doesn't. She loses the majority that she inherited from David Cameron in 2015, and she's forced, therefore, to go into a negotiation with the DUP, who have 10 seats, which is just enough seats to enable her to remain in office. And it was also an unnecessary election in many respects. In fact, Theresa May had ruled out calling a general election at least 5 times before she eventually calls it. And we know from looking back in history that calling an early general election doesn't always work out as a Prime Minister intends. Both Harold Wilson in 1970 and Edward Heath in 1974 called early elections and lost. And Gordon Brown was pressured by his aides to contemplate calling an early election in advance of being forced to call one in 2010. And of course, we don't know how that would have panned out, but it's always a gamble. Now, this is also an election where the electorate are incredibly volatile, and this in part explains why the polling shifts so dramatically during the campaign. In fact, there's more switching of voters in this election between parties than in any election since 1966. For example, 12% of 2015 Conservative voters switched to Corbyn's Labour Party. And the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is leader of the Labour Party at all is in itself an incredible feature of this election. When Jeremy Corbyn put his name forward for the leadership, he almost didn't make it onto the ballot because he didn't have enough support in the parliamentary party. And there's stories of him only just managing to get the last signature with minutes to go before the nomination papers are due in. And for that reason, the bookies at the time were giving him 100-1 odds of becoming leader of the party. And yet he becomes leader, and of course he dramatically shifts the direction of the party. And in this election, the Labour Party are very much an anti-austerity party wanting radical change. And finally, this was an election where there seemed to be a return to two-party politics. The two main parties managed to squeeze support for the smaller parties during the election campaign, and this resulted in 83.2% of the vote going to either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, a feat that hadn't happened since at least 1979. And with that said, I'm going to move on to talk about the context of the election. Probably one of the most important pieces of context for this election is the 2016 referendum that David Cameron is forced to call, having unexpectedly won a majority in the 2015 election. Now, the result of the referendum is that Britain votes to leave. The broader effect that it has on the electorate is it polarises the electorate into leavers and remainers, and these identities become very important to people in these years. In fact, for some people, those identities still are quite important. David Cameron resigns following the result, and there is a leadership election within the Conservative Party, which is a bit messy. Boris Johnson puts his name forward and then pulls out. Michael Gove puts his name forward and then pulls out. And the Parliamentary Party whittle it down to 2 candidates, Theresa May and Andrea Leadsom. And then Andrea Leadsom pulls out. And so Theresa May becomes leader of the party almost by default. And so she doesn't have a broader mandate as party leader. And she's confronted by a parliament that is deeply divided by Brexit. All of the major parties are divided, and there are divisions both within and between parties. And essentially what Theresa May is facing is a parliament that is full of Remainers, and she needs to deliver not just Brexit, but a particular version of Brexit. And so she feels that with her own party deeply divided on this issue and sensing an opportunity to win a majority, given the state of the polls, that it is a good opportunity to call a snap election, which she does. Now, focusing on the Labour Party, going back to 2015, Ed Miliband had lost the election in 2015. Despite gaining some ground in England, he loses ground in Scotland, and the Labour Party do worse than in 2010. Corbyn becomes leader unexpectedly and has a very strong mandate with the membership of the party, but he's facing a parliamentary party where he does not have a wide amount of support. In fact, his faction of the party contains really only about 40 people, and the rest of the parliamentary party are hostile towards him. And as a result of that, Corbyn faces a bit of a mutiny in 2016, and he loses a vote of confidence in the party, which leads to a leadership contest. Now, Corbyn wins that leadership contest very, very strongly, and this secures his position as leader. But going into the election, polling shows that Corbyn was a very unpopular leader of the opposition, an assessment that seemed to be confirmed when in the 2017 local council elections, the Conservatives had their best result in over a decade. Now, all of this points to the central importance of the campaign in explaining why the result confounded expectations that Corbyn's Labour would have as bad or worse a result than it had in 1983. And so it is to that campaign that we now turn. There's two key things that are important about Labour's election campaign. First of all, they neutralise the issue of Brexit by saying that they will implement the result of the 2016 referendum. And this really gets in the way of the Conservative Party's campaign, because the Conservative Party really want to focus on this idea of strong and stable leadership in order to get Brexit done. And the second thing is that the Labour manifesto message, for the many not the few, is really clear and effective. It really tells voters who perhaps are not paying that much attention to politics exactly what the Labour Party will do if they form a government. Now, the manifesto itself was actually leaked by the Daily Telegraph, but this actually seemed to help Labour as their policies proved popular with the public. It was by far and away the most radical manifesto the country had seen for decades, with commitments to, amongst other things, increase taxes on corporations, the wealthy and those on higher incomes, nationalise the railways and water, and scrap tuition fees. Now, just to give you a sense of the campaign, I'm actually going to show you the Labour Party's party election broadcast in full.
The choice in this general election could not be clearer. It's between a Labour Party that will stand for the many and a Conservative Party which only looks after the privileged few. Under the Tories, our NHS and social care has been pushed into a state of emergency. Our children's education has been hit hard by Tory cuts. The result has been more unqualified teachers and larger classes. The Conservatives have left us with the lowest rate of home ownership in a generation. 200,000 fewer homeowners than in 2010. And they've shown they don't care about our safety. They promise to protect our local police forces, and yet over 20,000 officers have been cut since 2010. Britain needs a government that looks out for everyone, not just a privileged few. The Tories have spent the past 7 years giving the super-rich tax handouts worth tens of billions of pounds, while working families are set to be, on average, over £1,400 a year worse off. And as for Brexit, the British people have made their decision. So now we need to negotiate a deal that protects jobs and the economy. But the Tories want to use Brexit to turn Britain into a low-wage tax haven for big business, putting millions of jobs at risk. Labour is the only party that can be trusted to put the interests of working people first in the Brexit negotiations. This general election is our chance for a fresh start with a Labour government. Instead of a country run for the richest, Labour wants to see one in which all of us can lead richer lives. A fairer Britain in which no one is held back. A Labour government will invest to create shared prosperity. They will invest in infrastructure, skills, new technology, and the green industries for the future. and in every region and nation of our country. Labour will protect our public services, give the NHS the funding it needs, and ensure good teaching in good schools for all our children. With Jeremy Corbyn, Labour will stand up for you. They will deliver a better, fairer Britain where prosperity is shared, where everyone is rewarded fairly for their work, and where a home to rent or buy is affordable. Labour will build a Britain for the many, not the few.
Now, in contrast to the Labour campaign, where Corbyn tended to speak to large, enthusiastic crowds of supporters, Theresa May spoke to set-piece, stage-managed events, and she was accused of avoiding the TV debates, of running scared. And again, in contrast to the Labour manifesto launch, which was seen as a big success, the Conservative manifesto launch was seen as a disaster. The proposal in the manifesto to make wealthier elderly people pay for their own social care was skillfully dubbed a dementia tax by Labour, which forced a U-turn from Theresa May. And in the campaign itself, the messaging from the Conservative Party became very repetitive, with Theresa May repeating the phrase strong and stable leadership ad infinitum, and the attempt in the campaign to essentially scare voters of the prospect of a Labour government didn't really work because the electorate felt that the Conservative Party was so far ahead that a Labour government was not a realistic prospect. Now, rather unfortunately, Theresa May, because of this repetitive messaging, was dubbed the Maybot during the campaign. And just to give you a sense of why that was, I'm going to show you another campaign video, this time from the Conservative Party.
I believe in the British people, our determination, our confidence in Britain, and our optimism for the future. Some voted to remain in the European Union 12 months ago, others voted to leave. But when I travel across our country, I see people united in their desire to make a success of Brexit. Because if we get Brexit right, then together we can do great things. We can seize the opportunity to build a Britain that is stronger, fairer, and more prosperous than it is today. Full of possibilities, more united and more secure. Controlling our borders, making our own laws, and doing business right across the world. And if we get Brexit right, we can move forward together with my plan for a stronger Britain. A plan that will build a stronger economy, more secure and well-paid jobs, new rights for workers, more affordable housing, protection from unfair energy price rises, and a good school place for every child. Because whether it's educating our children, caring for our elderly, or funding our public services, especially the NHS, everything depends on our Prime Minister being able to go to Brussels and get the best possible Brexit deal. To stand up for Britain and guarantee our economic and national security. And to fight to deliver what the British people voted for. And that's exactly what I will do. If you put your trust in me and back me on Thursday, the 8th of June, I will work hard every day to make a success of Brexit and build a Britain our children and grandchildren are proud to call home. If you put your trust in me and back me, I will seize the opportunities that leaving the EU offers our great country. And if you put your trust in me and back me, I will strive to make Britain a country that works for everyone. So when you go to the polling station on Thursday, think of the promise of Brexit and of our great country. Think of what we can build together and vote for me and my team to deliver a brighter future for all of us.
So we've reflected upon the fact that the Conservative campaign was not very strong, and I think a lot of that centres on the fact that the Conservative Party really want to centre the campaign on Theresa May as an individual and her leadership of the party, this idea of strong and stable leadership in the national interest, really is about Theresa May herself and how strong a leader she is. And I think really the more voters saw of Theresa May and the more voters saw of Jeremy Corbyn, the less they liked Theresa May and the more they liked Jeremy Corbyn, at least during the campaign. And this was surprising, particularly due to the fact that the right-wing print media relentlessly attacked Corbyn. But despite all of this, despite the relentless attacks in newspapers like The Sun, The Mail, The Times, The Daily Express, all of these newspapers, the polls continued to narrow. And in fact, a YouGov poll, a complex MRP poll released towards the end of the campaign, actually predicted the hung parliament that was to come. The most striking thing about the result, aside from the fact, of course, that Theresa May loses 13 seats and Labour gain 30 and she's deprived of a majority, is just how big a feature age is in terms of predicting voting behaviour. In this election, for the first time, age is the most important predictor of voting behaviour there is. Just to give a bit of detail around that, amongst the very youngest voters, according to YouGov, 18 to 19-year-olds, 66% of people voted Labour at this election, and that's compared to only 19% when we look at those aged over 70. And what we find is that the crossover age, the age at which people become more likely to vote Conservative than Labour, is 47 at this election. Now, what's also interesting is the extent to which class is not important in this election. When we look at the relationship between class and voting behaviour, there's almost no relationship there at all. So why did the result go the way that it did? Well, lots of people, lots of commentators have said, well, the Conservatives threw the election away. And of course, it's true, as I've set out, that the Conservative Party did not fight a very good election campaign. But it is also the case that Theresa May increases the size of the Conservative vote. And actually, it's the largest vote share that the Conservatives get at a general election since 1983. This idea that the Conservative Party threw the election away is not that convincing. I think lots of people did vote Conservative despite the campaign. It's much more convincing in this election, I think, to say that the Labour Party fought a very strong campaign with a very clear message for the many, not the few, and that they managed to neutralise the issue of Brexit in order to make sure that people heard that message. The other thing I think that's important is that most of the time voters are not paying attention. So whilst voters had quite a negative perception of Corbyn going into the election, the more they saw of him during the campaign, the more they liked him and the more they liked their message. And this was despite the constant attacks that Corbyn was subject to in the media. So look, it's a really interesting election because in this election, the campaign really matters. And it's quite unusual, actually, in all of the elections that we've looked at for that to be the case. In fact, I can't really think of one. Maybe 1992 is an example. Most of the time, it's the context that has driven the result. It's divided parties. It's weak leadership. It's all sorts of other things. It's very rarely the campaign. It's very rarely the manifesto. So really interesting election, really significant election. And I've only got one to go, which is 2019. So I look forward to you joining me next time for that. Don't forget to like and subscribe.